Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to talk about king and pawn endgames and the strategy and the approach you should take. I'm first going to start by covering some basics because if you don't know them, then this is going to be hard to follow. So first of all, let's just get rid of the basic stuff. Firstly, the opposition. The opposition occurs when two kings are on the same file or on the same rank. With an odd number of squares between them, so either 1, 3, or 5 squares. So in this case, let's say white's king is on d2, black's is on d4, that would be opposition. The same would apply if the black's king was on d6 or on d8. And it doesn't matter which square the king gets to, it's still the opposition. So this is the most basic endgame in chess, and black draws it easily because of the opposition. When white goes king d2, black has to play king d4, and the opposition says that whoever it is to move when opposition occurs is at a disadvantage. So in this case, white is at a disadvantage because it's white to move. The kings are in the opposition. White simply cannot make any progress. Therefore, white's going to go e3 check, and black just keeps doing the same thing. Now, in this position, black needs to be able to meet white in the opposition on both d5 and f5, whether depends on whether white goes to d3 or f3. So black plays the most flexible move, king e5, and whether white goes to d3 or to f3, black's just going to copy that and keep the opposition until the end. So that's the first thing. Before we get into the basics of king and pawn endgames, you can visit Nocti by following the link in the description. I've prepared a theme on king and pawn strategy, and it consists of 14 positions you can play out against Nocti. So Nocti is going to be playing like a human, trying to trick you, sometimes not playing the best moves. I've selected various difficulties, so some of them are going to be more challenging, some of them are going to be easier. But what you can do is practice the positions you're going to see in the video, as well as some additional ones against human-like AI. So let's say practice. I know this position and I know it well, so I'm not going to ruin it for you. But basically, you can time yourself, select the difficulty, and try to beat Nocti. It's much better to play positions out and develop theoretical knowledge into a skill than reading books and trying to memorize something. Other than themes, Nocti can also do the same thing with repertoires, and you can import any type of position you want and practice it instead of learning lines blindly. If you want to visit Nocti and unlock all the premium features, visit the link below and use the code Hanging Pawns to get a massive 64% discount. Let's go back to king and pawn endgames. The second thing is the rule of the square, and I'm not going to use a completely basic concept, a completely basic position to describe this concept. Basically, if you draw a square from the pawn to the corners, if the opposing king is within that square, it can catch the pawn on its way to promotion. So let's do that for the h5 pawn in this case, because white's threatening to go g4 and queen the h5 pawn. Is the black king within the square? Yes. Therefore, black is still safe regarding that pawn. Is the white king within the square? Excuse me. Is the white king within the square of the b pawn? Yes. Okay. So now we apply the opposition. Okay, so we move forward, king to e5, and black needs to move one way or the other. We know that white's king is within the square of the b pawn, so whether black moves here or plays c5, we just win. If king d7, we can go g5, and the king is outside of the square. If king f7, we can just come over here, pick up all the pawns and win. And if c5, we can simply take because our king is within the square of the pawn. Okay, so that's concept number 2. Concept number 3 is the concept of spare tempi. So in this case, it's obvious it's white to play. Black has the opposition. If white's pawn was on g4, this would be, basically impossible to win, and white could lose. However, how can white reach the opposition with an advantage? We want the same position with black to play, because if it was black to play here, black would have to move to either d6 or f6 or f7 or e7 or d7, giving way for the white king to enter the position and win the game. So we force black to have the move by playing our spare tempo, g4. And now black needs to make a decision. It doesn't matter where black goes, we go the other way and we win the game. So spare tempi. Okay, and finally, triangulation. This is a slightly more advanced concept, but it's very, very simple. In this case, it's white to play. If it was black to play, black would be losing immediately because we apply two principles we have just learned, the opposition and the rule of the square. In this case, black is within the square of the b pawn. If the black king wanders away to one of these three squares, then we simply push c6 and the king is outside of the square. Also, now black has the opposition because it's white to play, so black doesn't have to move. If black had to move, black would have to go to either e7 or e8 or d8 or c8, and we would just advance and continue the same process. So we need to get the same position with black to move, and we do that by transferring our king to the same square with three moves. And we use that we do that using a triangular pattern. So in this case, we could either go king e5, king d4, king d5, or we can go king d4, king e5, king d5. So once we go king d4, the black king, the most resilient move is king c6. Now we just go king c4, and we repeat the process. We're going to use these three squares because the king went this way, king d7, king d5, and it's black to play. Black needs to give way and move outside of the square. So let's say king e7, now c6. The king is obviously outside of the square, and we're winning, takes, and that's it. Okay, so those are the basics. Now we are going to move on to 7 complex king and pawn positions using these concepts. Okay, the first position is, I would say, relatively simple if you have grasped the concepts we have just talked about. So in this case, we need to force white to lose all the spare tempi they have, and that way we can simply enter the position and win all the pawns. So you can pause the video here if you want to try and solve it yourselves. So of course, before we do that, I'm just going to explain a couple of things that may help, practically speaking, during tournament games. So first of all, king and pawn endgames are very exact, and there is no, they are very binary. Either you win or you lose or it's a draw. So technically, you should be able to get to the bottom of each position and calculate correctly until the end. That's what strong players do. In rook endgames, in knight endgames, bishop endgames, in the middle game, you physically cannot calculate until the end, but in king and pawn endgames, that's usually what you are obliged to do. Now, secondly, you always have to make it easier to calculate if you can. So what I like to do is count the moves. Let's say both sides are promoting. You can just count the number of moves for each side. So in this case, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moves until the a2 pawn promotes. That's a bad example, but okay. So let's do this position. Of course, conceptually, you always want to gain space with your king. You win by having a more active king than your opponent. So in this case, king f5 is of course the correct move. And now what can white do? White can play a3, they have a reserved tempo here. White can play h3 or h4 or f4 or king g2 or king h3. Now h3 doesn't do much, a3 doesn't do much. They technically waste one of white's extra tempi. f4 loses a pawn. h4 might be the best move, but it still loses. So basically whatever white does, if white waits with a3, we can play h4 check and we enter the position. Let's say king h3, king f4, and now white only has one sensible move, king g2. And after king g2, we can win a number of ways. This is our spare tempo now. We can play f6 or f5, pick up the pawn on f3, but white would play h3. So we can play h3 check, distract the king, enter the position, and we are simply too quick at winning all the pawns. So applying these basic principles to slightly more complex endgames involves calculating the rule of the square for each pawn and whether giving up a pawn, in this case, giving up your h pawn, giving white, in this position, giving white potentially a passed h pawn and queening your f pawn is winning. So you have to do a lot of calculation. Now let's do the second one. This position is also relatively simple. And once again, try to pause the video and solve it yourselves. Just apply the principles that we talked about at the beginning of the video. So how do we win this position? Well, first of all, white's threatening to take on c4. And if we do nothing, if we make a nothing move, let's say h6, then white plays bc4, king c4, and enters the position. Let's just have a look at that. Takes. And now you have to calculate who's quicker. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Not quick enough. So we cannot do that. Just count the moves. So we can deduce that black needs to react to this pawn on b3 by either taking or playing c3. I would advise you to always calculate the most forcing lines first, if you can. So let's calculate. C takes b3, a takes b3 is forced, otherwise we simply win. And let's remember the opposition. So in this case, our king is on d5, white's king is on e3. So how can we gain the opposition from that position? So c takes b3, a takes b3, how does black get the opposition? How do you get an odd number of squares between the kings with white to move? The answer is pretty simple, king e5. And white needs to make a choice. White can either go to d3 or to f3. Wherever they go, we go the other way and win the game. You can ask yourself, well, what happens on h5? So let's have a look at that. White has another tempo with h5. Unfortunately for white, we also have a tempo with h6. So it doesn't work. So let's have a look at that. C takes b3, a takes b3, king e5, the opposition. Now, if king f3 or king d3, we just go the opposite way, and it's fairly simple. If h5, the only move that wins now, the only move that gives us the opposition is h6. And now we win. Now white needs to make a choice. Let's say king f3, king d4, king f4. Let's calculate. Okay, we should have calculated sooner. So let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. So let's do it one more time. So king d4, king f4, king c3, king f6, king b3, g5, hg5. Do we have to react to that? No, we don't have to react to that. We calculated incorrectly. So let's do it once more. King d4, we don't have to take on g5. King d4, king f4, king c3, king f5, king b3, king f6, a4, here, okay, hg5, h6, a3, no, okay, we actually have to take on g5. If we play a3, then white plays g6 and queens with check, okay? Geometry, so hg5, h6, a3, h7, a2, oh, this is unfortunate. So this is what you have to do. This is how you have to calculate before making a move. Okay, so let's do it once again. So c takes b, a takes b, king e5. Okay, it's clear that we're winning. We know that we're winning, but we still need to calculate the correct move order. Once again, if white doesn't play h5, then we don't have to play h6, then it's simpler. Then we just do this. And now white is one tempo too slow. If we do the same thing, without these moves inserted, obviously it takes white more to queen, so we're winning very simply. Okay, so those are the basic concepts. Now let's move on to slightly harder endgames. Next endgame. So now we know the rule of the square, now we know the opposition, now we know triangulation, and we should be able to deduce that black can move away from the g-pawn and that white cannot take. So we aren't obliged to make nonsensical moves like f4, although f4 may be good, I don't know. But we can afford the move like king g8 or king f8, because if white takes on g6, then the king has exited the square of the f-pawn and black simply promotes. Okay, so why don't you pause the video and try and figure this endgame out. Okay, so first of all, let's look at the most forcing moves first. If we go f4, this may seem, interesting, but unfortunately, after king f4, king f6, e7, king e7, king e5, the king is still within the square of this pawn. So if we play g5, king f5, the king catches this pawn, but we can now go g4, and after king g4, we can go king f6, cut the king off completely, and we should be losing despite that. It just doesn't work. So on f4, king f6, even e7 seems just much better for white. I don't even know what to do here. So f4 is a complicated move. It's a forcing move. You need to look at forcing moves first, but you need to be able to calculate all the way until the end and make sure that they aren't losing. If they are winning, they're winning. So no good forcing moves. So now we have to move the king. Obviously, a5 doesn't really work. So let's look at king g8 and king f8. King g8, we can almost immediately discard because we need to get closer to the e-pawn, and the opposition isn't really going to matter much. If on king g8, king f6, we play king f8 and they play check and just pick up our stuff. So king f8 seems more logical to me. I think that on king g8, white may even be able to afford king takes g6, because if we play f4, there is e7. Yeah, that's the reason. So if f4, then e7, and we aren't stopping this pawn. So this doesn't work. It's going to be mate in 1. So let's have a look at king f8. King f8, now we know that king g6 is losing. What else does white do? E7 makes no sense, because on e7, we would just take that pawn, and the king still wouldn't be able to take on g6. So let's say king f6. That seems to be the most promising move. Now, if we play f4, we actually have to calculate a lot of stuff. If f4, e7 check, king e8, king e6, I think we're just queening, so that doesn't work. If king f8, king f4, that's the human move because it doesn't allow us to queen. King e7, we're going to pick up that pawn. King e5, what now? So this seems to be the critical position. So we are using the rule of the square, and we are calculating based on our pawn queening and us not getting mated by the e-pawn. How do we make progress here? We know that if we move away to f8 or to e8, let's say, or to d8, let's say king d8. Now, if the king goes to f6, we cannot play f4. King f6, f4, king f7, and we lose first. Okay, so we're not giving away ground. So we need to waste the tempo without allowing the black king to f6. d6 isn't really that relevant, but f6 is. So we only have one tempo, and that's f4. We have to calculate f4. So let's look at f4, excuse me, g5. Let's look at g5, king takes f5, because they have to. Now, what do? We still cannot take on e6, so we have another tempo, g4. Okay, king takes g4, king takes e6. Now, the white king is on g4, our king is on e6. Who's better and why? That's what you have to figure out. Okay, so pause the video again. That's the critical position. Try to figure that one out. So g5, king f5, g4, king g4, king e6. And who's better? Of course, white's better. White's winning. White's winning by a very, very large margin, because white just goes king g5 and white's going to pick up all the pawns. White has an extra pawn and the spare tempo, no debate. So how do we win? Okay, king f8 must be correct. King f4 must be correct for white because there are no other moves. King e7, okay, must be correct for black. King to f4, king to e5. Let's look at another forcing move. We tried g5 and king f5 and g4 and king g4. We lose 2 pawns. Let's try f4. f4 white absolutely must take. King f4, king e6. Let's imagine that position. The king is on f4, the king is on e6. It's white to play. Okay, this seems much better. f4, king e6. Can white win this pawn? Let's say king g5, what do? We play king f7, and the king cannot take the pawn. The king must move away, and we're simply going to make progress with our extra pawn. What's important here is, once again, that white mustn't leave the square of the g-pawn, and that white has no passed pawns of their own. Usually in king and pawn endgames, passed pawns are what's most important by a very large margin. Okay, next one. Now, let's apply the opposition, and let's try to solve this endgame. It's black to play, pause the video. Okay, so we have to look at a couple of options. Let's look at the most forcing first. Always look at the forcing moves first. H3, king g3. Now, the problem with H3, king g3, H4, king g4, is that whatever we do, let's say we go king f6, the king is coming to g5. And even though we can play f6, we cannot really play f6 because we lose the g-pawn. And we have to move our king away. So we have no pawn moves, let's say king e7, and now white can simply play h5 or f5, liquidate all the pawns, and it's going to be a very, very easy draw. So h takes g4 doesn't work. What else can we do? We can wait with our king. Let's say we try to gain space, king d5. How can white avoid being in trouble here? Of course, if white goes king e3 here, we can just win the g4 pawn, so that doesn't work. So white either has to play f5 or g5 or take. Okay, let's calculate taking first. That's the most obvious. So g takes h5, g takes h5, and then king e3. Okay, how can we win? Well, it's very simple. We can play f6. Takes, king e3, and f6. Now white must move away. White can play king d3 or king f3. If white plays king d3, spare tempi, we know what to do, f5, and now we're in. On king e3, we go king c4, and we win the game. And if on king d3, f5, king c3, then we just go king e4. So, okay, white cannot take on h5. We know that much. But what if white doesn't take? What if white plays g5? How do we make progress here? It's black to play. We can seemingly take more space with king d4. Okay, so that seems tempting. We can also try to enter the position this way. So let's calculate king e6 first. King e6, king e4, black to play. Can we make progress? We have to play f6. That's clear. Because if we move our king, white enters the position. But on f6, they don't have to react. So let's have a look at that. King e6, king e4, f6. Of course, if white takes, then on king f6, they have to be careful not to lose this position, but they can luckily get away with f5 and takes and king d5. King f4, I think, loses. I think king d5 is okay. Because now on king g6, let's say we go king e5 and you are forced to lose the pawn. And on king f7, let's say we once again go king e5 and here we go king d4. This is, I entered the slightly complex endgames, but I'm just trying to show you all the variations. So that's what happens if we do nothing, if we wait with king d5. But let's calculate the second most forcing move for white. So one of them is hg4. The second very forcing move is f5. Now, white must react. White must take one of the pawns, and it doesn't really matter which one, because we're going to end up in the same position. So what's key here after f5 is to calculate one capture, so we reach a position like this. It doesn't matter which pawn white takes. And of course, us making progress on d5 or on c5. So it's white to play. I think we can safely discard g2, g3, and f2 because that's giving away space, and we will likely be able to gain the opposition, but we still have to try and figure them out. So let's say king f2. If king f2, king d5, king e3, king c4, king f2, king d5, king e3, king c4, king f2, king d4, king f3, king d3, king g2, king e4. Yeah, okay, that's winning. And if we play king c5, king e3, king c4, king f2, king d4, king f3, king d3, king g2, king g2, king d4, it's still winning. Okay, so king f2 is definitely losing. If king g3, king d5, king f3, king d4, king f2, king e4, king g3, king e3. Okay, that's okay. We don't have to look at the absurd moves. So the only move that makes sense, sort of, is king e3. And now, I hope you don't make a mistake here. You have, well, a couple of sensible options. Obviously, you don't go back. You don't go to e6 or e7 or d7 or c7 on c6. So you look at king d5 and king c5. One of them wins the opposition, the other one loses the opposition. Okay, so of course the opposition is a position where kings are positioned in a way that they have an odd number of squares between them, and whoever it is to move is at a disadvantage. So of course king d5 is a dead draw. King d5, king d3, white has the opposition. There is no way to make progress. King c5, king c3, king d5, king d3, and so on. We therefore have to play king c5. And now we reach the same, if king d3, we reach the same position with white to move, and we simply win. If king e3, king c4, if king c3, king e4, and game over. So this position was actually very, very simple to solve. This is from one of my students' games, a tournament game, 90 plus 30. At this point, they both had less than 5 minutes on the clock. And my student did play f5, and I was really proud. f5 is the cleanest win. All you have to know is basic opposition to find f5. All right, next position. Now, this position involves a concept that's relatively rarely used. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure this one out. Okay, so we have a couple of moves we can look at. The only moves that make sense are king f6, a6, which loses our spare tempo, it doesn't do anything, and gh4. Okay, so a6 I think we can safely discard because white has spare tempi. We're not winning the opposition, white still has h5, so if a6, h5, it's black to play, and it's likely going to be a draw, I think. a6, h5, we have to play king f6, and white can play king d4 or king d3 and keep the opposition. So let's say king d4, king f5, king d3, king e5, king c3, king e6, king c2. Yeah, okay, it's fine. And if king d3, king e5, king c3, king d5, king d3, king e5 is the easiest draw. So we're not playing a6. If we play king f6, then white still has a spare tempo with h5. So king f6, h5, king e6, king d3, king d5, and I think we just repeat. At some point we're going to have an opportunity to use this tempo, but I don't think it's going to matter. If king f5, king c3, king e5, king d3, king c3, yeah, we have no entry points into the position, and whether we have the spare tempo or not, it doesn't make sense. So king f6 and a6 are a draw. Now, we have to look at the most forcing gh4. It may seem weird to play gh4 because the white king is within the square of the h-pawn, and because white gets a passed pawn because they take on f4, but we're going to use the concept of restricting the white king. So we take, they obviously take on f4, and now what's the winning move for black? This is something you have to know. It's h5. And what's the point behind h5? The point behind h5 is that it doesn't allow king g4. If white could play king g4, white would be winning very, very easily. But now, in order to reach these pawns, white's going to have to play king g5. And if white plays king g5, white exits the square of the g-pawn. So if king g5, we just play h3, and white isn't catching the pawn anymore. So that's how we win this one. Now, the final position is from practical play, also one of my students' games. And I remember that we looked at this position for an entire lesson, maybe even more. So it's white to play. Your job is to figure out whether white's winning or losing or drawing and figure out why. So pause the video. What I can tell you is that when you have an endgame like this, the easiest way to assess it is to count the number of passed pawns and where they are relative to the kings. So in this case, white has a passed d4 pawn, and obviously black's within the square is blockading the pawn. Black has a passed f6 pawn, or it's going to become a passed f6 pawn if black chooses to push that pawn forward. There are a couple of entry squares for the white king if white gains the opposition. So let's say white plays, triangulates and wins the e4 square. Let's say king f3, king e6. Okay, now this is just no contest. Let's take the square and king d6. Now, we would like to enter e5 and pick up the c4 pawn. But what we have to remember is that we need to remain within the square of the f pawn. So what's the square of the pawn on f5? This would be the square. So that means that we're relatively safe unless we try to queen our pawn with the aid of our king. So let's say we step on to c6, black would just play f5 and win straight away unless we're promoting with check. So that's something we have to be aware of. Now, how do we make progress if we don't do that? I managed to outplay my student. He's rated about 1100 FIDE. I managed to outplay him with the only trick I could see from here with white, playing h4, h5, and of course, black shouldn't take that pawn. He did take that pawn, and then I had an obvious way into f5. So that's one way to win. Unfortunately, on h5, black can simply do nothing, and you're not making any progress. So we want to reach the d4 square. If we play g5, black's playing f5, and we aren't making any progress, we're going to have to head back, and it's going to be a draw, obviously. So the only sort of sensible attempt is d5. And after d5, black needs to be careful. So you may think that king c5 is absolutely necessary, because if you don't play king c5, I'm going to go king d4. So why don't you try and defend this endgame with black? What would you do? Okay, this is a very hard endgame. So if you go king c5, white is winning. And here we introduce the concept of entry squares. In this case, white has no entry into e5. What's preventing the white king from coming into e5 is the pawn on f6. We need to get rid of that pawn. So we play g5, and that's the end of the game. Black can take on g5 or play f5. It doesn't really matter. Whatever they do, we play king g5, king e5. And this pawn is 4 squares away from queening. This pawn is 3 squares away from queening. And white wins whatever black does. If black waits, let's say king b6, then we go d6. And if king c6, king e6, and we are actually going to queen, we check. We are 2 squares away from queening now, and black is still 4 squares away. So the only move that makes sense for black is to go f4. Now, black is 3 squares away from queening. We are 3 squares away from queening. If we take that pawn on f4, we have to calculate the opposition. If we play d6, we have to calculate what happens after f3. So this is a practical endgame from tournament play, and it's extremely difficult to figure out. So let's say d6, f3, d7, f2, d8 queen, f1 queen. Queen a5 check, king, I don't know, c6, queen a4 check. Is that a winning endgame? Are we getting mated? Okay, so that's one line. In my opinion, you don't enter messy lines in which you both queen, because in practical play, due to time trouble, you can mess up, you can miscalculate, you can hang a check, hang your queen, hang mate. So if you can find a line in which your opponent doesn't queen and neither do you, but you win by using the opposition later on, that's much safer, even though both lines may be winning. I think d6 is winning. I think so, because I win the pawn on a4. Let's just double check that. So d6, f3 is forced, d7, f2 is forced, d8 queen, f1 queen. I was going to play queen a5 because that's the most tempting, but I have many other checks. I don't think I have mate. So let's say queen a5, king c6, queen a4 check, king somewhere, I don't know, b6. Yeah, we're just picking up all the pawns. This is easily winning. But let's try to find an alternative. So the only alternative I can see is taking the pawn on f4. So let's calculate that, because it's in the spirit of this of this lesson. So king takes f4, king takes d5. Let's put that on the board, it's going to make it easier. So we cannot make progress, we cannot go to e4, okay? But I can tell you immediately that white is easily winning, and there is a trick you can use to figure out who's winning this position without doing any calculation at all. So obviously this is going to depend on who gets the opposition. Black has no spare tempi. Black has no option other than to move the king. If they play h6, the king is obviously too far out of the way of white's h6 pawn, so black must move the king. Now, whether black plays it smart and plays something like king d6 eventually, or something like this, and tries to keep the opposition is irrelevant, because we have two spare tempi. We have h3 and h4. Now, playing h4 straight away would be a drawing blunder. Why? Because you got rid of your spare tempo for no reason. Use your spare tempi wisely and frugally. So we play h3, forcing the king back. Now, the king could come to d5 and lose the opposition straight away. This is easy. Now we don't even have to use our spare tempo. The king must move away and we just enter the position. But let's say king c5. Now we play king e4. Okay, king e6. How do we enter the position? There is only one winning move. Only one. If you get carried away and play king d4, then you have to start calculating lines where both sides queen, and then it gets very complex. So just use your second spare tempo and it's very easy. Whether the king goes to c5 or to e7, d7, f7, it doesn't matter. We now go king d4, and the king is too far away from these pawns. We're just going to win. So let us go back. So we played king f3. They played king e6, we played king e4, okay, king d6, d5, okay. So we tried king c5 for black. It didn't really work, because on king c5, we have an entry into e5. So what does black try to do? Black needs to be quicker with their counterplay. Black needs to distract our king from the defense of the d-pawn at a more opportune moment. So the only sensible move we can look at is f5 check, because it's a forcing move. Now let's calculate. gf5, gf5, king f4, king d5, king f5, king d6, king f6. Who has the opposition? Pause the video, figure it out. If you're black, this is your only chance, so you can go for it without calculating, because everything else loses. If you're white, well, you also have no choice, but okay. So let's see. gf5, gf5. If we play king f5, king d5, if king f4, I was trying to be smart with king f4, king d5, king f5, but I don't think I get anywhere. So here, here. Okay, this is too much. Let's say h5, h4, king d6, king f6. Oof. Okay, let's say h5, h3, king d6, king f6, king d5 here. Oh, black is winning this. We cannot move towards the h-pawn because the b-pawn is going to queen. So I think king g5 is out of the question. We just need to repeat. Yeah, this is correct. We cannot win the pawn. So we do this, takes here somewhere. King c2, h4, king b2, h5, king a3 or king c3. I don't know what's better. Let's say king c3, b2, h7, b1 queen, h8 queen. Oh, we should have taken the pawn on a3 so that this isn't check, but it's still the same thing. So we managed to lose the game. Okay, so once again, king f3, king e6, king e4, king d6, d5. Now king c5 loses. f5 should be a draw. Should be, so takes, takes. King f4, takes, takes. And now whatever black plays, we cannot afford to go for this pawn because black's going to pick up the b pawn. Okay, so these were the endgames. I hope you got something from them. I hope they were useful. Once again, I've prepared many of them in the theme on Nocti you can find below. Practice makes perfect, so try to solve more on your own. Try to use the concepts I was applying today. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.